The Commission for Employment Equity has released the status of workplace transformation report to the Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi. The 19th CEE annual report and public registers for all designated employers on the status of workplace transformation, and it reveals at a broad level continue to paint a picture of very slow but steady pace of transformation, this especially at the top 4 occupational levels. Compared to the 2017 statistics, representation of the white population group has shown a decline of 3.6% at senior and 4.3% at skilled levels respectively. Dr. Annelie Gildenhuys is Employment Equity Commissioner from the Department of Labour. She joins us. A very, very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Francis.
Tepiso. So let's break it down and say, what does this actually mean?
Well, this year-on-year Commission report was handed to the Minister this morning, and there is no significant change in that the top levels of representation is mostly still from the white population group. We do start seeing a change in the more technical skilled and supervisory levels, but there is no significant change over the last 3 years. And certainly also not in terms of persons living with disability, and women remain very low in their representation as well.
So I just want to look at the figures, exactly what they mean. So you said we spoke about mostly the white population. Is it mostly white males that are at the top level of at least certainly senior management?
Yes, there has been a marginal change, as we've just seen in the statistics, but mainly at top management and senior management is mainly represented by white males.
So what are their functions defined as? So if we're talking about somebody at senior management level, what are their functions? What are we talking about?
So when you look at top management, that would be strategic direction, strategic management, and when you look at senior management is operational and just in terms of executing strategy. But those two levels are, traditionally made up of the top decision making.
And that breakdown with regards to skills development, what does it look like?
So in terms of skills development in the Employment Equity Act, employers yearly report per the standard categorization and in terms of your grading levels. In the skills level, one would expect now that one would have some sort of naturalization already. But what is a bit worrying is that when you look at who we train at that level, it seems to still also be white male. And when people leave those positions, they are also replaced by the same group that they came from. So when people say, but these levels there are very few of these levels at that top level. It's not the bigger end of the pyramid. But what is interesting in our transformations in this country is that mostly the same people get re-employed. So we tend to re-employ white males. And you would have seen that the change is quite marginal. And also when we train or promote, we see the same focus. So it does indicate a very slow focus.
So I'm just looking at the figures. So that points to 66.5% of top management positions across public and private sectors combined.
Yeah, that's correct.
Any particular sectors that are most guilty of lagging behind at not only appointments at senior management levels, but that skills development that we were looking at?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say. Mostly, 95% of our reports come from the private sector. We do see a different picture in local government and provincial government. When you look at who submits the most number of reports, it's quite interesting that it's manufacturing and then agriculture. So traditionally also report in that. When we talk about non-compliance, and we're not talking about people not submitting their annual reports, so not doing what is measured in the Act. What we are looking at is that people have traditionally put in or have to put in an employment equity plan, and with self-imposed numerical goals, but then don't seem to achieve that. So when people start saying with those guilty of not complying, we're not seeing not complying
that would
to
point
what
to
the
self-regulation
Act requires.
itself not working.
Yes, because remember, it's self-imposed numerical goals. towards achieving a positive end towards the justice in the workplace. And this is for this reason that the Commission has, since last year, started looking at proposing sector targets, in setting realistic targets over a period for each sector, which then is far more of a definite goal to be achieved over a period, as opposed to self-regulation.
So when you say okay, so the Minister earlier spoke about increasing the risk of non-compliance. So what instruments would you use? I know that there's been amendments, I think, to Section 3 of the Act. What specifically are you going to be targeting?
Yeah. So, of course, the Employment Equity Act has got fines. If you don't comply, there is a scale of fines based on whether it's your first or second. If you're not complying with Chapter 2, which is non-discrimination, is preventing and prohibiting discrimination, of course, then that is a non-discrimination case. What we are looking at in terms of compliance is Section 53, as you mentioned, has always been in the Act, but it's never been implemented. And so the Commission's recommendation now, as well with the sector targets, is to start looking at a certificate of compliance, that companies who do not comply will not be able to transact with the state. And then the Department of Labour has increased the Directorate of Inspection to start looking at people who generally don't comply with the Act and its requirements.
So just looking at some of the strides that you say you've made, you say that Indian white female population groups are better represented in higher occupational levels. What's preventing black women from at least making some sort of significant strides?
Yeah, it's one of those things that women generally are underrepresented at more senior levels, but black women in particular seem to have that barrier to progression, and that's the very thing that the Employment Equity Act looked at, or the aim of it is to ensure that you are able to have upward mobility in your career regardless of who you are or your race or your gender. And it seems to be that there is subtle prejudice still prevalent in the way in which we approach justice in the workplace. Is it really subtle?
Because, I mean, just looking at some of the sectors, I see, for instance, if you're looking at the hospitality industry, that's grown exponentially and it contributes quite a significant amount to GDP of the country. But some critics say just looking at the structure of the hospitality industry, it goes largely unregulated or even policed.
Well, when you engage with these sectors and you ask them what the barriers are, mostly all employers would report that there are no barriers. But when you do an in-depth analysis of diversity management, you will always find the barriers of women can't be employed or women have double roles, or, you know, it's almost triple jeopardy. But then people would come up with very stereotypical traditional barriers as to why women can't, and then they just don't have the experience yet, or they're not ready yet, and yet we focus our attentions on the same place when we look at who
So
we
would
train.
you then say, as a Labour Department, part of the large challenge you face is that your mandate is on the one level increasing employment or tackling unemployment, and on the other is ensuring that the sectors themselves transform, that therein lies the challenge?
The aim, you know, the objective of the Commission of Employment Equity is to monitor and to advise and to look at research as to what is happening. And we always have to remember that the objectives of the Employment Equity Act is to ensure that we have justice and fairness in the workplace. And so all these years later, it is argued that we haven't achieved that, and it's very slow. And why is it? And that's what I mean by the subtle prejudice, because nobody goes out and say, well, we are actively discriminating if there's a case of discrimination, or some people saying it's time for it to be over. We haven't even begun to achieve that work.
So some researchers even argue that perception of transformation or equity is also part of the problem, so that your perception of equity, if you're so-called born free, is different from somebody who's a black female who would have fallen within the category of previously disadvantaged.
Yeah, I think, you know, the whole concept of positive enforcement or employment equity is an emotional one, and it always depends on what you think legislation can and cannot do for you. The aim is to make your mobility free of the race and the gender and the age that you are, and to look at creating that fairness, and that's what we're battling with all these years.
So finally, if you say that there is a very slow pace of transformation and it's been largely stable, would you then say that perhaps more vigorous structural change is required for us to see meaningful change in terms of employment equity?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what the aim is with the proposal of sector targets. But I think we mustn't, in all of this, lose the message that I think that there has been significant success in the country's history of our development, at least at professionally qualified and skilled, where we're seeing a more normalised reflection of society and building the skills. But one would now like to start seeing that representation gets there at the middle and senior and top. And this is perhaps why, if we set more realistic targets per sector to be achieved, it is a lot easier to create that structure.
All right, thank you very much for joining us. Employment Equity Commissioner at the Department of Labour, Dr. Annelie Gildenhuys.